Well, as you can see from the service sheet, during the next hour, there'll be 3 readings from the Bible, followed by a short reflection on 3 verses from Luke chapter 23, as well as some music and times for quiet thought and prayer. And the question we'll be thinking about is this: when you look at Jesus on the cross, what do you see? When you look at Jesus on the cross, what do you see? Because sometimes appearances can be deceptive. Back in the 1980s, a woman was at a car boot sale and bought a job lot of knickknacks, including some bangles that she wanted and some costume jewellery, which included a sort of large and dirty imitation diamond ring. And she haggled the seller down from £12 to £10 for this largely worthless collection of bits. 30 years later, she was rummaging through a cupboard and the ring fell out on the floor, and it kind of sparkled in the light, and it got her thinking. So she took it to her local jeweller, and he sent it to Sotheby's, and Sotheby's suggested the woman might like to have the item cleaned up and sold, which she did. And on the day of the auction, the dirty old ring from the car boot sale sold for £656,750. Turned out to be a high-clarity 26-carat diamond about the size of a 10-pence piece. So appearances can be deceptive. What do you see when you look at Jesus on the cross? We're going to have our first reading from Luke chapter 23. And we're going to begin to read at verse 13. Pontius Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." With one voice they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the 3rd time he spoke to them, "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Now moving on to verse 32. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with Jesus to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus hangs there crucified. It is a form of killing designed to humiliate the naked victim so publicly and shamelessly that they lose all value and worth in the eyes of their friends and society. Crucifixion is so grotesque, the only natural response to the victim is revulsion. You cannot look at Jesus on the cross and see anything of value. And so it simply cannot be the case that Jesus is the Messiah. The only response is to laugh and jeer and further humiliate him. The Jewish leaders said, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah." How sick is that, to accept that he saved others, but to laugh because you've had him crucified? And of course, they're not at all worried that Jesus might actually prove them wrong, because no one comes back from crucifixion. You've already been conquered. It's clear already Jesus is an utterly useless human being. And then the soldiers mock him. It's hilarious. This is apparently the king of Israel, the rival to the Emperor Caesar. It was written on a sign above his head. How ridiculous. And then even one of the criminals crucified with him mocks him. "You're the Messiah, are you? Save yourself and us." And he hurls abuse at Jesus, as if Jesus could save them. He's been crucified. What an idiot for claiming to be the Messiah. Jesus looks so wrong that everyone else imagines they're right. Not even a crucified criminal considers himself beneath Jesus. It seems impossible to look at Jesus on the cross without mocking him and spitting at him. Which means that it's likely we'd have done exactly the same if we had been there. If you'd been on an afternoon walk that day and seen naked Jesus nailed up there, would you have loved him and worshipped him? Or would you have walked round him, eyes averted, like when you avoid a homeless beggar or a drunk person passed out on the pavement? We would have completely dismissed Jesus as a nobody. We would believe the lie that he must have deserved it, that we're better than him. We're good in comparison to someone who got crucified. But something different is happening in the mind of the other criminal crucified next to Jesus. He says to the first one, "Don't you fear God, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Perhaps he'd heard Jesus pray for the forgiveness of his executors instead of shouting abuse at them, and realized, like Pilate said, that Jesus is an innocent man. Everyone else standing there took Jesus' crucifixion to mean they were better than him, but for this second criminal, the bright light of Jesus' innocence exposes the fact that It's everyone else who is guilty. Only hearts corrupted by sin could stoop so low as to mock God's innocent Son. You could have taken anyone who was there that day and crucified them instead of Jesus, and they would have been more deserving of it. No one there was innocent, but Jesus was. Jesus alone was perfect. And as this second criminal looks at Jesus, he realizes in comparison that he is deeply guilty. So much so that in being crucified, he's only getting what he deserves. He says he deserves to die. Human beings crucified Jesus. Human beings mocked Jesus. Human beings concluded that we were superior to Jesus because he was crucified and we were not. How sinful we are. But there was a man there beside Jesus who realized he was the sinner, not Jesus. And instead of asking Jesus to help him escape, he accepts that this is the punishment he deserves. And now what about us? We're going to have a time of quiet now, and it's a time to consider the suffering and humiliation that Jesus endured even though he was innocent. It's also a time to think how I might have treated him on that day if I had been there. And it's a time to consider what I deserve when I think about myself in comparison to the innocence and the purity of Jesus. What do you see when you look at Jesus on the cross? Really, the reality of crucifixion is repulsive and it's repellent. You can't look at a crucifixion victim and think happy thoughts. You can't look and have hope for them. But the criminal next to Jesus looked at him and said, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom." Wow. Something is happening to this man that happened to none of the people who crucified Jesus. He looks at Jesus, naked, bleeding to death, struggling to breathe, utterly humiliated, and he says, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom." The sign above Jesus' head says the King of the Jews, but is meant to be ironic. It was put there by Pilate to insult the Jewish leaders, stating that Jesus really is their king, but also demonstrating Rome's total dominance over them. Their king is now just human wreckage. But this criminal reads the sign and sees truth. He believes it. He looks at Jesus and he sees it somehow. Crucifixion is supposed to prove that nothing Jesus said is true. And yet this criminal looks at Jesus and believes in him. He looks at Jesus and sees God's chosen king. He looks at Jesus dying and believes that in the end, it'll be death and not Jesus that lies defeated. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. The cross represents the defeat of Jesus, the victory of his enemies and the dominance of Rome. But the criminal looks at Jesus on the cross and he sees the victorious future King of Israel. The cross is not the end for Jesus, it's the pathway that leads to triumph. That's what he sees. And this is the definition of faith. If we stick to biology for a moment, then we'd have to conclude that this is the end for Jesus. Death is final. Assuming, of course, that there's nothing different about Jesus. But this criminal trusts that Jesus is different. And that's where faith comes in. Biology can't lead you to the conclusion he comes to. Biology alone says Jesus is still dead today. And not just biology, life experience in general has taught every human being since time began that death is final. And yet this criminal looks at Jesus and says, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom." Just imagine how strange it would be to be experiencing one reality, the defeat of Jesus, and yet somehow having this confidence that there's a greater reality to come, the victory of Jesus. How strange it would be to look around and realize the entire scene is lying to you. All the abuse hurled at Jesus, all the blood and stench of death, all the cheering of the leaders of Jerusalem to see Jesus on his way out, and yet to know somehow that the future is a world where Jesus is King. And this is the difference between Jesus' followers today and the world out there. The crucifixion of Jesus is a historical fact. The difference is when we look at Jesus on the cross, we see a future king. When the world looks at the cross, it sees a failure, a victim, a tragedy, a death, a nobody or whatever. But ultimately, whatever they see the end of Jesus. But not us. Even as he cries out in a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I place my spirit," and then dies, like that criminal, we see our King. What do you see when you look at Jesus on the cross? That criminal saw the future king, but he also saw his own sin. So there was hope for Jesus, but surely no hope for him. And yet let's hear his words one more time. "Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom. Remember me. Have mercy on me." Despite his crimes, despite his sin, despite Jesus' perfection and future reign as king, this man somehow believes that it's worth asking Jesus to remember him. He actually imagines that there is a chance that not only Jesus, but he too might have a future beyond crucifixion. He actually believes that Jesus might just possibly share his victory with a criminal. When someone's on the way up to being rich and famous, the hangers-on often say, "Oh, don't forget where you came from." In other words, don't change your friends because we want to get some of the benefits of your riches. But if you were a criminal who knew you deserved God's judgment, would you dare ask the man God has chosen to be king of the world to remember you and have mercy on you? Why would a king in his glory ever have a second thought about a crucified criminal from his past? And yet this man seems to know enough about Jesus to believe that he may have mercy even on terrible sinners like him. His hope is that one day he will see Jesus again. So he says, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom." And then he waits to hear what Jesus will say. And let's pause for a second and ask ourselves, what might Jesus have said? He could have said, "It's a bit late now to ask for my help." He could have said, "You're not good enough to be part of my kingdom." Or, "I don't really associate with people like you." He could have said, "Look, I don't even know you." But what did he say? He said, "I promise you that today you will be with me in paradise." Isn't Jesus so kind? A criminal dared to hope that the future king of the world might even remember him. And Jesus said yes. And there would be no delay. That very day, the criminal would be welcomed into a place no criminal could ever go without having Jesus as their friend. What the criminal didn't know yet was that it was by dying on the cross that Jesus had paid for all his sins and wiped his record clean. As Isaiah said, "He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed." That's the kind of king Jesus is. He's the perfect man who died an unjust and humiliating death so that anyone who asks him can be with him in paradise. When the soldiers who crucified that criminal saw him dead and gone that evening, what they couldn't see was that actually he was in paradise, forgiven of all his sins, enjoying being with Jesus, his King. And so we have this message: whoever you are, whatever you're like, whatever you've done, even if the whole world turns against you, even if no one loves you, even if you cannot love yourself, look at Jesus on the cross. Look with the eyes of faith. Look and see a perfect man. See the King of future glory. See a King who welcomes all who come to him and gives them a place with him in his kingdom. And so know that with Jesus you are loved, you are forgiven, and you have good hope of a future filled with joy.